Hey, I'm some nobody, and for a long time I've been a passive observer of the Tomislav versus stock minigun debate. You know, it's been an ongoing discussion in the heavy main community for what feels like forever now, and since we're never getting the heavy update, it'll probably keep going until the very end. Funny thing I noticed about is I feel like a lot of people are on the opposite side of the gun they actually like. Like, there are plenty of people arguing in favor of the minigun they actually use, but there are also a fair amount of stock minigun mains arguing that the Tomislav is a direct upgrade to stock and it shouldn't be. And then you have some Tomislav mains arguing that it's worse than stock, so it's fine as is. Everybody wants to be the underdog. I've read in-depth breakdowns about why one gun is better than the other, and I've watched videos where somebody talks about why their favorite of the two is their favorite. They're both great guns, I use them both depending on how I'm feeling, but it's always bugged me a little that they're the only two miniguns people will go to bat for. Heavy has 3 other primaries and it seems like nobody's willing to ride or die for them. Now I'll admit that's reasonable for the Huolong heater. That's a gun that requires a teammate to go out of their way to support you to get consistent value out of it, and if you get a buddy to play Scorch Shot Pyro and just target all the people that you want to target, you can actually tear up a server with it. Now I'll admit it's actually a lot of fun to have a pet Pyro, but if you got a friend that's willing to give up any kills and just get assists all game, you'll be way better off just having them pocket medic you while you use any other minigun. So I would not recommend trying to convince people that the Huolong heater is actually Heavy's best primary. Had a friend do it once, wasn't pretty, we talked about it for years. But I think the other two miniguns don't get enough credit. A lot of people just see the Natasha as an easy way to ruin a scout main's day, and honestly,
Yeah.
but the Natasha's alright even if you're not specifically performing hate crimes against skunts. The downsides can screw you over sometimes, but the upsides can get you kills in situations the other miniguns wouldn't. But you know, the minigun I actually want to talk about today is my personal favorite of the bunch, and one that I think way too many people dismiss as only being good in MVM. The Brass Beast. Now right off the bat, I'm gonna say something that'll make everybody on the train scoot away from me because I'm clearly a maniac. The Brass Beast needs to be put in the same weapon category as the Direct Hit, the Widowmaker, or the Bizarre Bargain as the Heavy skill-dependent weapon. You see, Heavy is the class in TF2 with maybe the most built-in counters because he's the class with the most raw damage possible. Obviously, he's got his natural counters, the Sniper and the Spy, but by design, Heavy can't just walk up to you and do 600 DPS. Heavy needs to spin up his gun before he can fire, and he needs to be revved or firing for a full second before he reaches max accuracy and damage with any minigun. So if you're starting a fight from neutral, certain classes can annihilate Heavy before he even reaches max DPS, and even if a Heavy catches you off guard, there's a small grace period to get around a corner. And once you're around that corner, you leave him the option of either spinning down to chase you and resetting his DPS counter, or staying revved and letting you escape or get a medkit. And it's not really a 50-50 there because you can just hear whether or not he's revved. If you're a soldier or a demo and you can get around a corner while fighting a Heavy, your splash damage means it's pretty much a free win if the Heavy doesn't disengage. If you're a scout and you hear the Heavy unrevved, depending on how the fight went before you got around the corner, you can probably run back and shot him to death before you can spin up again. So corners can fuck Heavy over by a fair amount, but he kinda has to play around them because a Heavy in a sniper sight line is like your 100% save file when your mom forces you to let your little cousin play your games. But even if you take corners and snipers out of the equation, Heavy's mid to long range DPS suffers greatly due to a combination of minigun inaccuracy and damage fall off hitting him quick. So yeah, Heavy isn't the easiest class to counter because Spy exists and gets countered by hitting 3 then left clicking, but Heavy does have a lot of counters. A lot of people like to say that Heavy takes no skill because he doesn't have crazy mobility and his micro gameplay isn't the most intensive, but doing well as Heavy takes a lot of macro skill. There's a ton of factors to take into account because you'll get punished for being revved and firing for a long time, but you'll also get punished for not constantly being revved. You jump in without thinking and you'll find out just how fast some classes can deal 300 damage. But if you can balance the seesaw of always being revved before a fight while only being revved when necessary, and never playing around corners while always avoiding sniper sight lines, and maintaining the line of sight on your enemy while also spinning around frequently to check for spies, your reward is the pure heroin-like rush of filling your ears with a sea of damage dings and a big fat juicy block in the kill feed.
Get back to talking about the brass beast, you fucking nobody.
Now, how do the innate weaknesses of Heavy as a class lead me to say the Brass Beast is Heavy's skill-dependent weapon? Well, because when you look at the Brass Beast stats, all of Heavy's weaknesses are amplified by the weapon design. Heavy gets punished for not being revved preemptively. Revving the Brass Beast takes forever. Staying revved makes Heavy easy to backstab and headshot. You can barely move while the Brass Beast is revved. And both of those stats make playing corners against Heavy even more effective, because if you overextend into his line of sight, you'll have a longer grace period to escape, and his only option to chase you is to wind down, which means he'll have to do that long-ass rev again. The Brass Beast is not a minigun that can be revved lightly. The macro requirement to do well with the Brass Beast is double what stock would ask of you and triple of what the Tomislav asks. Every rev with the Brass Beast is a valuable resource and a commitment to your game knowledge and positioning.
Son, you know, once you start, there's no going back.
I know.
This means total commitment. Once you begin the path, there is no leaving the path. Are you sure you're ready for that? I mean, really ready?
I guess so.
Neat. We'll start tomorrow.
The Brass Beast doesn't spin up so slow that the classic jump around the corner and rev up in midair doesn't work, but it does spin up slow enough to leave you defenseless if you misjudged when and where you should have revved up. If you decide to warm Oksana up, you better be sure you can make her finish, because if you don't, she's gonna leave you butt-ass naked in the middle of downtown Badwater. What I'm saying is, with the Brass Beast, you're more than likely only gonna get one chance to spin up in a fight, but if you use it wisely, you can change the hierarchy of power in the TF2 universe. It isn't just Heavy's weaknesses that the Brass Beast amplifies. The 20% extra damage and the half health damage resistance mean that running away from a revved up Heavy isn't just one method to counter him, it's the only way out. TF2 is a big numbers game, and it may be one of the most studied multiplayer games of all time. There are more people who understand how every single mechanic in TF2 functions than there are for any other multiplayer game, and even if they don't fully understand what goes on under the hood, at this point in the game's life, every TF2 player lives and dies by their numbers. It takes 3 direct pipes from a demo man's grenade launcher to kill a full health Heavy. Depending on damage ramp up, it can take 3 or 4 direct hits from a rocket launcher to kill a full health Heavy. If 2 Heavies begin shooting each other at roughly the same time, but one of them is overhealed and the other one is just at 300 health, the overhealed Heavy should win, right? The Brass Beast completely changes the rules of some of these encounters. Maybe a part of this is just that the Brass Beast isn't that popular, but you would not believe the amount of fights you win just because the other guy doesn't expect you to survive for another second. And when you have roughly 600 DPS, surviving 1 extra second is a huge deal. And that DPS is really what it's all about, man. If doing well with the other miniguns is like heroin, doing well with the Brass Beast is like Coke. Nah, honestly, it's better than Coke. It's Dr. Pepper. You really have not lived until you've caught a flog pyro trying to oomph and put the Brass Beast to his chest and send him to God. All the miniguns melt shit, but the Brass Beast does it so effectively and takes so much setup to pull it off that when you actually do pull it off, it might be one of the most satisfying things in TF2. Another satisfying thing about the Brass Beast, it is a mad underrated sentry buster. Despite sentry guns having a resistance to minigun damage, the Brass Beast just does so much DPS that anytime I destroy a level 3 that's actively being repaired by its engineer, I can see the engineer stand there in confusion for a second afterwards. And that's really something that can't be understated, the clear-cut confusion that comes with fighting a Brass Beast Heavy. Despite the damage Heavy is capable of with all of his miniguns, there's still a fair amount of players that know the numbers and trust the numbers. They look at a revved up Heavy and they say, nah, I'd win. And depending on a million different circumstances with other miniguns, maybe. But the Brass Beast does not need to be on you as long as any of the other miniguns. So the margin of error for peak firing a revved up Heavy or trying to double jump all around his head is way tighter. You know, the Brass Beast is 14 years old and people still don't expect it to do as much damage as it does. And you know what else they don't expect?
And I have a shotgun. Haha, let me prove it.
Seeing a heavy with a shotgun is a bit rare, but seeing one use a shotgun and his minigun is like finding a bot hoster that deserves to live, in that it barely ever happens. Now, despite the fact that any TF2er that has ever talked about the Brass Beast past just calling it trash will recommend you run a shotgun with it, I think the idea of playing heavy and not running a sandwich is actually one of the biggest things keeping people from really learning the Brass Beast. You know, TF2 is 17 years old and the sandwich was added in the game's first year, and to this day it is still one of the best items in the whole game. Healing is the single strongest mechanic in all of TF2 and decides games more than any other factor. The lunchbox items are such amazing tools that are so valuable that the community has turned the sandwich into Heavy's default secondary. But over the years, the narrative has really shifted away from the food items are fantastic and towards this idea that shotguns are useless on Heavy. And they're not. Anything that can two-shot a skunt is never useless. They are consistent damage dealers that don't limit Heavy's movement and can be used at max efficiency the instant you need them. Almost all of Heavy's weaknesses that I just went over are circumvented by having a shotgun, but the food items are so good that every Heavy is used to solely relying on their minigun for damage, and they honestly should be. But you have to recognize you're trading a flexible offensive and defensive tool for sustainability and support capabilities. It's a worthwhile trade, and the food items are better picks 99% of the time, but I don't understand why so many people act like Heavy's default secondary being a shotgun was an oversight on Valve's part. TF2 players were very stuck in our ways, so I think a lot of people try and run a lunchbox item with the Brass Beast and come to the conclusion that you have to either play defensively with it or just ride the payload all match. You have to think, the Brass Beast is a souped up version of the stock minigun, so it works best when you play Heavy following the logic of his stock loadout. And I think most of the time when you do that, you will find that the Brass Beast is actually one of the most aggressive miniguns in Heavy's arsenal. Gamers aren't going to walk into a revved up Brass Beast's Heavy sightline if they can help it. I mentioned earlier that you're probably only going to get one rev in a fight, so you'll find the most success when you use your shotgun to carve out a good position and a good moment for it. Some people might say a primary weapon needing to synergize with the secondary means the primary weapon is bad, but you're not synergizing with the secondary to just make the Brass Beast usable. You're doing it to make the Brass Beast better than stock, because if you can get it to the dance, the Beast will bust a move, but getting it there is the hard part. Oksana ain't getting in your hatchback, you better have a limo for her. Heavy as a class is designed to be punished for not being ready for a fight, and no minigun is more punishing in that regard than the Brass Beast. But you know a good way to avoid getting caught lacking by a scout? Blowing his head smooth off in 2 clicks.
See this? Alright? Old man gave me that when I was in grade 7. Seen a lot of action. Safety always off. Told me he was proud of me once. Fucking prick.
The last thing I want to talk about with the Brass Beast is its relationship with the Tomislav, which is something that I never really stopped to think about before I decided to make this video. You know, the Natasha and the Forlong Heater are both entirely different weapons from stock in terms of what they offer, but Oksana and Svetlana are 2 sides of the same coin, they're sisters. The Tomislav is a gun that dulls some of the pain points of playing Heavy by reducing or straight up removing some of his built-in counters at the cost of reducing his DPS. The Brass Beast amplifies the Heavy's built-in weaknesses but compensates you by increasing Heavy's damage output and survivability. The Tomislav is more flexible and easier to use, but it has lower overall potential. The Brass Beast is rigid and very punishing, but has the potential to reach higher peaks than the stock minigun. It's like the Liberty Launcher and the Direct Hit if the Schwicky Schwag was just a little bit better, like if it had 20% 30% damage penalty instead of a 25%. Whatever, point I'm trying to make is that they are both evolutions of the stock minigun. The Tomislav is the stock with its stats evened out, and the Brass Beast is the stock with its shit min-maxed to hell. The Tomislav is way more versatile and, most importantly, can be run with a sandwich, but it does 450 damage per second compared to the Brass Beast's 618 damage per second. And I will grant that that gap lessens as range increases, but when they are both at their peak, the Brass Beast does a full 168 more damage in the same time frame. Svetlana can kill an overhealed heavy in a second, but Oksana can take down the heavy, his medic, and do 18 damage to whoever else might be there at the time. I think that's a pretty decent reward for the investment the Brass Beast requires. And honestly, it's why I think the only thing that the Tomislav and the stock really have over the Brass Beast is the fact that they pair well with the Sandwich, which I'll admit is a pretty big deal. I think the Brass Beast is way stronger than anybody gives it credit for, but the Sandwich is stronger than all of Heavy's miniguns. But even still, I don't care for the Brass Beast slander because I feel like a lot of it comes from people who hate playing Heavy in the first place and think he's boring, but also instantly discard the minigun that asks the most of you. I'm not trying to say that I'm better than anybody just because of what gun I like using in a game so old it'll be graduating secondary school pretty soon, but I am trying to say that if people were a little more open-minded and saw things from different perspectives, they'd realize the Brass Beast deserves respect. And I'd honestly say it's balanced as is, and the only changes I would want for it are universal changes for Heavy as a class. First thing that immediately comes to mind is just letting him switch weapons sooner after unrevving his minigun. Currently there's like a little 1-second buffer after Heavy fully spins down where he can't switch off, and I think removing that buffer would be good for all Heavies regardless of what they're switching to. I can't tell you the amount of times I tried to save a teammate with my lunchbox items, but I couldn't because of the buffer. And I think all the miniguns except the Tomislav could do with like a little 10% buff to accuracy, and bring the Tomislav's buffed accuracy down to 10% instead of 20, so it's still the same after this change, but all the miniguns would be a tiny bit more accurate. Those are just ideas off the top of my head, but Heavy ain't getting no fucking update anytime within my lifespan, so that's all meaningless. To summarize my points, the Brass Beast is like the stock minigun times 10, and even though the downsides can feel like it's you versus Saxton Hale, being smart with when you rev up can overwhelm the enemy team like a zombie infection, and covering the Brass Beast's weaknesses with a shotgun will confuse them like a randomizer.